doctor by training, not so much by practice though, and was included in her, I suppose, last couple of years when she moved to Ryanke's estate. Now, I think that all of us know that Margaret was tough. She had spent many years, as far as I can recall, smoking. And as everyone knows, smoking is not exactly a ticket to longevity. But certainly she managed to overcome those years of smoking and lasted 91 years. Despite, I'm not sure what her pack year history was, but certainly it should have shortened her life. And I think that's one of the characteristics that I would like to show is Margaret's resilience, and particularly her cheerfulness, especially towards the end of her life when she was becoming more incapacitated by this by her illnesses. And despite that, she remained mentally alert. She questioned me on a lot of the research that I'm doing. She asked me about why, how, when, all questions that I would hope that a student would ask me. And Penelope mentioned to me that Margaret had been given the opportunity to go to Oxford, but her parents said, no, you've already cost us too much. And I was thinking, well, she could have gone even when she was 80, and she would have made a successful student. So I think that's really enough of my memories. I think if I can hand over to Adam, the son of the family, to take us forward.
Thanks very much, Neil. I'm going to try the snazzy mic. The one that clips on. Let's see if this works. Because then I can use my arms. I do use my hands. I use my hands to talk. Does this work?
Yeah.
Great.
This one is off.
It's off.
Okay. So, thank you very much, Neil, for your lovely welcome and introduction, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. It's actually lovely just to meet people and make all the connections to Mum and her network of friends who have been incredibly important to her over the years. So Margaret was my mother for 55 years, and with the wisdom that comes with age and time, I've come to appreciate what an extraordinary mother I had, and I didn't always. From a traditional Scottish Presbyterian family, she became a very modern woman, an occasional single parent, a field biologist, a teacher librarian, a fossil collector, artist, poet, police volunteer, and a rounded polymath. An unusually complex, stoic, and interesting person. Mum had a very rich inner life and a strong moral compass. And I couldn't possibly take you through her life and do it justice. And as we all knew, she had many different facets. I'm not sure anyone except Penny knew them all. And possibly Penny will delve into some of the facets that nobody really knows from Mum's early life. So in the next few minutes, I'll try and describe a few of her facets, the ones that I knew as her son. Margaret, the occasional single parent. So at some point before my 4th birthday, Radford, my father, took off to Edinburgh on sabbatical. And in typical Radford fashion, advised Mum to re-qualify to support all these children you have had. Well, instead of filing for divorce, Mum enrolled at the College of Education to re-qualify as a biology teacher, and I started nursery school. So began Mum's life as an occasional single parent, ferrying her kids to and from nursery school and school, rushing between lectures, writing assignments, and she notes, giving my fellow students a lesson on snails. She also gathered materials from the Retief farm trees to draw up an identification key, and memorably went to Inyaka for a week of practical biology in the mangrove swamps. Adam, she notes in her memoirs, had bitten my thumbnail, and I had blood poisoning. Well, that innocent bite had consequences, instant karma. My sisters took over bathing me from the age of 5. It was the end of bath time with Mum. I had many memories and stories of Mum's dedication to us, her children, and most of our family holidays to the Cape every year, mostly our family holidays to the Cape every year, and many bushwalks and weekend trips to the Retief's farm. They were wonderful childhood memories. She organised everything, of course, and without her incredible energy, none of it would have happened. She attended every swimming gala I raced in as a kid and took great pride in my meagre athletics achievements. Once, to everyone's astonishment, she took part in the Ridge Father's Day shooting competition. A 50-metre rifle prone event with a .22 long rifle. And she won the event by a huge margin. And in my eyes was instantly elevated to supermum. So our admiration for each other's achievements was mutual. Of course, she wasn't only being an occasional single supermum. She was a full-time teacher, first at Tyra, then the Ridge, JP Girls, JCE, and finally at the Johannesburg School of Art, Ballet, Drama and Music. I knew her as a teacher, and she was quite unconventional. Margaret, the teacher. As a newly qualified teacher at Tyra Mental's Children's Hospital, enthusiastic Margaret, the new maths teacher, provided compasses and protractors to her students, only to be horrified when the students turned on each other, now armed with lethal weapons. At the Ridge, as a new science teacher, she let off a stink bomb in the classroom to demonstrate gaseous diffusion, with all the doors and windows closed. The classroom erupted, windows and doors were flung open, and boys ran out into the courtyard, gasping and coughing and causing a nuisance very theatrically. And I was one of them, possibly the ringleader. Headmaster Alan Shields decreed a ban on any such experiments at the very next staff meeting, and Margaret's stink bomb experiment became a legendary cautionary tale on how not to teach science. But it's the only science lesson that's ever stayed with me. At the School of Art, Ballet and Music, Mum started the audiovisual department in the library to support the emerging talent coming through and record their shows and exhibitions. Her headmaster, Mr. Fall, who had deep suspicions and concerns about Mum's liberal and outspoken politics, introduced her new cohort of pupils as the best school librarian in the world. See what I mean about the hands. But it didn't stop Mum from speaking openly in class and in the staff room about racial equality and acceptance of homosexuality, which must have given Fall more than a few grey hairs under the apartheid regime. So as a Ridge student, I had the privilege of learning the biology curriculum from Mum, but I absorbed more from her on the many bushwalks and drives we did when I was growing up. Margaret, the field biologist. So Mum was a trained biologist and field researcher in plantation tree diseases on the rubber plantations in Zambia, I think. She was also a keen scholar of paleoanthropology, cave art, geology, geomorphic processes, and she loved Southern Africa. She couldn't go on a bushwalk without leaning into her passions and talking to us about what she was seeing, teaching us to observe and to look for fossils, ancient artifacts and seeds, collect butterflies or flowers, and everything had scientific names. She couldn't resist teaching, something that I've inherited according to my wife, Michelle. We have a coffee in the morning, and apparently I like to teach at 6 o'clock in the morning. While the scientific names of plants were lost on me as a child, still lost on me now, I developed an interest in Mum's passion in my 30s, particularly paleoanthropology, genetics, and zoonoses, which I pronounced zoonoses in a conversation with Mum. Mum had a fit of giggles, which lasted several minutes, and caused her to have an asthma attack. Zoonoses, she repeated. Dear Lord, she said, wiping the tears from her eyes and convulsing into another fit of laughter. Zoonoses, what an idiot. Mum had always read a great deal more than me, and it was time to catch up. But this started a conversation with Mum about her passions, which continued throughout the rest of her life and inspired me to keep reading and studying life sciences to this day. We talked a lot about genetics and how genetic research was reshaping narratives of how humans have come to occupy and dominate every ecological niche on Earth. But there was also a lot of debate on a great many other topics. I think I lost most of those debates, although I feel like I won the debate in which Mum argued that Putin and Assad were great world leaders. I think I won that one. She loved to bait me. She loved to bait me. And some of you probably know that side of Margaret too. Margaret the artist, Mum had powers of observation well beyond most people I've known. And perhaps it was a superpower, but it's hard to pick one with Mum. Her training as a field biologist meant she didn't just look at stuff, she studied it. Trees, plants, rocks, landforms, paintings, people. And she drew them, sketched them, rendered what she'd seen as art. And when it came to people, much of what she saw was comical. For example, Dad playing chess, being masterful, dominant, superior. Michael Newpin, one of Dad's colleagues, ensconced in an armchair looking at one side with cocked eyebrow, being arrogant and dismissive. Her father, the surveyor, Gordon Lister, with pencil and sheet in his 70s, frail but still industrious and capable. Her constant childhood companion and hero. She also observed and could express deeper and more intimate moments in other people's lives that were not part of our family even. I think there's a painting of workers toy-toying that really captures their rage, addressing 100 years of struggle and 100 years of white oppression, and who can blame them? Her wonderful Reiki's carers in masks, another beautiful painting. Their constant kindness, care, and compassion through the lockdowns. And thank you to all at Reiki's for your incredible care of Mum. Those at her bedside in particular, thank you. Another painting of Philip Storr, my father's best friend for his entire life, after the death of his only daughter. And you can just see the brokenness in him. And her mother Mary in the last few moments of her life wrapped in blankets. And you look at that and the eyes, they well up. Incredibly powerful. And I'm not sure my mum could bring herself to paint my sister Emily. So great and overwhelming was her grief and loss. Mum always dismissed her attempts at art. She referred to her work as caricature in a self-deprecatory way. But the journalist Hitch once said that the secret of great writing was to be interesting and learn how to write. And perhaps this is true of art too. And A.A. Gill once wrote, "The art of drawing and the art of life is the art of omission, what we leave out, who we leave out." And what Mum sketched and painted might not have been good technically, I don't know, but she learned how to paint and capture a moment, an interesting moment. And there's nothing superfluous in her art. And in that respect, she was masterful. Mum, the poet. Mum studied and read poetry, and one of her most tender memories of her marriage was that Dad read her poetry throughout their married life. But rather than describe her deeply analytical process, she pulls poems apart. I'm going to read you one of her poems, my personal favorite, where every family trait gets a mention. Dancing Jeans. I might need some water. Thanks, Ben. I'm going to use an Afrikaans expression, you get quite droog up here when you're talking. Dancing Jeans. One can trace from face to face a nose, a smile, a look. Generations have their place in one's genetic book. Bandy legs or upright stare, even teeth like millipips, sloping shoulders, thick dark hair, narrow waists and too broad hips. Physical elements are easily found, but what of elements of mind? Unfaithful, profligate or mean, those who drank and failed and fell, untruthful, feckless, boastful, reckless make their contributions to, it seems, of their questionable genes. But one can look back with pride to honourable or successful men, lovely women, upright souls, and confide one's hopes to them. In a tribal group, these stories are told as messages and warnings to the young in the fold. Wonderful, isn't it? Mum's ability to see things in people they didn't like about themselves and clearly articulate what she saw did get her into trouble sometimes. Larry Scully, a very old family friend, was most offended by Mum's description of why the Brontosaurus grew to such large proportions. Larry was over 7 feet tall. Because, she explained theatrically, they had to accommodate an enormous stomach adapted for processing ferns with very low nutritional value. She said this after observing Larry help himself to all the salad at dinner. Okay, it's not about poetry, but it's a very Margaret story. I'm almost about to wrap it up. Mum, the Stoic survivor. Mum experienced a huge amount of loss over the last few decades of her life and a lot of loneliness. The loss of her father, her children who emigrated overseas, the death of her mother and husband, both of whom she nursed in their dotage, and most shattering of all, the loss of Emily, my sister, to suicide. She managed all of this with the love and support of her incredible friend group, and thank you all. Her beloved friend Anna-Marie and the Martinson family most of all. And I think she bore her losses with such dignity and stoic courage. My mum has been an extraordinary gift. I'm glad I got that one. Sadly, she's gone, but she would have approached the end knowing her son was happily married and came good in the end. That he had managed to become the father, the husband, the chicken wrangler, the green-fingered gardener, and the provider she hoped I would become. And when I leave South Africa after this visit, she would have been happy knowing that I returned to a thriving blended family full of love and life and laughter, and I owe her an enormous debt of gratitude. Over to you. We're just rigging up the sound. There we go. Water. I'll put it the other way around.
So I can either see you or see my notes. And I'm afraid it's the notes. In 1953, our 22-year-old mother was a young botany graduate and lost her first job because she had a hole in her heart. It was a job that she had thoroughly enjoyed. She wrote, "I was working for African Explosives, who sent me down to Somerset West as an apprentice plant pathologist. They wanted to assess the efficacy of their insecticides in the apple orchards of Grabouw, the peach orchards in Franschhoek, the orange orchards in Riverdale, and weeds in the wheat fields of Darling. We travelled long distances to farms throughout countryside of a soft beauty. I was thrilled. The young men in the department who did the driving and interacted with the farmers were charming to me. After 6 months of falling in love with the Cape, I was sent home ignominiously. Not only was I considered unsuitable for associating with the powerful blast sprayers and toxic chemicals being sprayed, but medically I had a congenital hole in the heart and was considered not robust enough to do the job. What on earth am I going to do with my life? She asked herself. She visited Val Greathead, the Vice-Chancellor's secretary at Wits, who said, "I will find you a job." At 23, Mama joined the cardiac research unit at the Witwatersrand University Department of Medicine. Her job was to manage the ballistocardiogram. This simple mechanical instrument consisted of a wooden board suspended on springs on which the patient stood. The wooden board vibrated to the to the pulses of the patient's heart, and these were recorded as graphs. My mother's job was to analyze the patterns produced and compare and correlate these with other data, electrocardiogram graphs, and case histories. She writes, "It was not difficult. I bought a copy of Moroni, Statistic for Beginners. Then I enlisted the help of the professor of statistics at Wits. I had not much idea of what I was doing, but kindly Dr. Bernie van Lingen and added my name to a paper he wrote." Nearly 70 years later, when I visited for Christmas last year, my mother recounted to me an encounter with one of the patients who arrived to have his heart examined. This was a young French-speaking Mauritian, Hervé Largesse. He took one look at the winsome Margaret operating the ballistocardiogram and said, "Will you go out to dinner with me?" "Only if you meet my parents first," said my mother. Hervé dutifully met Gordon and Mary Lister and told them a little about his family, a snippet of which my mother recalled 70 years later. Bear with me. "My father," said Hervé, "has an automobile and a chauffeur. But my father loves driving, so the chauffeur sits in the passenger seat while my father drives. Every time they pass a church, the chauffeur reaches over and raises my father's hat." "Mum," I said, "he sounds delightful. How was the dinner?" "It was entertaining," she replied, "but he was not a prospect for me. I knew his heart was shot." This anecdote is one of many that my mother shared with me only very recently. One of the many friends that my mother has cherished for life, Wendy Crott, born Retief, wrote that she will remember my mother for her, in capital letters, gumption, twinkling eyes, and kindness. To these qualities, one could add that she was fiercely independent, spirited, stout-hearted, intelligent, vivid, observant, intellectually curious, competitive, financially astute, resourceful, and fun. And beneath all this, she had mettle, was obstinate, and had a fighting spirit. What shaped my mother into this formidable person? Until lockdown, I had a sketchy understanding of my mother's formative years, and so too of aspects of her nature. During lockdown, she wrote her autobiography titled Stories of a Tentative Adult, the broad outlines of which I will share today. So let's go back to the beginning. Margaret Lesley Lister was born in Postmasburg in the Northern Cape on the 9th of January 1931 to Scottish Presbyterian parents, Gordon and Mary Lister. Gordon and his wife had left Scotland to seek work in the colonies due to the economic hardships that attended on the Great Depression between the world wars. Mama wrote, "Postmasburg was in the desert, west of Kimberley, where a black mountain, almost solid with manganese, was developing a tiny mine. My father did his best to find a house of some sort, 2 rooms, with a passage between, a shelf at the end of the passage, with a primus stove for cooking, and sackcloth for the ceiling. Under a straggly acacia tree nearby was a Coke refrigerator. This had a tank of water above a box in a wire cage of Coke, and water dripping through the Coke evaporated to cool the contents. This is an Africa that has simply disappeared, except in memory." Of her birth, my mother wrote, "It must have been awful for my mother. She never had another child. I was a breech a breech presentation. There were no doctors, no midwives. I think an Afrikaans farmer's wife helped her. I was blue and put on the concrete floor to survive or perish. After this shattering experience, my father applied for a job on the Johannesburg Reef, and we moved to Krugersdorp. In Krugersdorp, my mother made her first friend for life, Bryony Gale, and her parents established a friendship with Gwen and Neil Holford and with the Blackwells. My mother and Tricia Blackwell remained friends till Mama's death, bound by their history on the mines, common acquaintances, and a shared sense of fun. And Tricia has been a wonderful friend to me in London. The new house in Randfontein Estate was made of wood and corrugated iron and had a garden that my mother loved. However, as she writes, one night the cocoa pan train chugged past on the east side of the garden of our house, and with a roar, the entire ground disappeared into a sinkhole, and the last cocoa pan just made it across. I thought this very interesting and exciting. The grown-ups were alarmed, upset, declared it unsafe. My mother demanded modern accommodation. The mine shoveled an entire rock dump into the huge hole, but no one could see the bottom. We were moved to a block of houses beside the Robinson Lake. The house beside Robinson Lake was isolated, and my mother was exempt from attending school as she was regarded as fragile. She led a very solitary life. While her mother socialized and played golf, my fragile mother became an explorer, she wrote, and walked to the plantation of gum trees and the Slimes Dam, which was strictly out of bounds as cyanide was used in the ore extraction process. I met a bullfrog with a gaping mouth. I nearly killed Glenn Brownrigg, getting him up the pepper tree onto the roof of the house, whence he could not get down. I set fire to the felt trying to play with a toy stove. After these bold beginnings, and with very little experience of mixing with other children, my mother was sent to Pretoria Girls' High as a boarder. This was during the Second World War. Due to fuel rationing, she was often invited to go home with friends for the holiday. An invitation to visit the Retiefs farm was the beginning of another enduring and rewarding set of relationships. The Retiefs and their neighbors, the Roberts, who had farms in the Magaliesberg, had teenage children. And my mother happily joined this group of strong, handsome, able young people playing tennis and being introduced to farm life and the history, paleontology, geology, and abundance of plant and animal life in the Magaliesberg. As children, Emily, Adam, and I loved visiting the Retiefs. For us, their farm and the kloof was the best place on earth. 10 years ago, in 2012, I went with my mother to visit Pierre and Isla on the farm. No sooner had we sat down than Pierre brought a collection of bleached animal skulls to the table. Margaret, can you identify these skulls that I have found on the farm? He asked. Of the 4 skulls, Mum was able to guess 3 correctly. A civet was one, I think. The 4th was a skull, round and large, like a very big white smooth pebble the size of a coconut. Pierre, said Mama sternly, I doubt that you found this on your farm. Pierre did his best to look innocent. I think that this must be the skull of a sea turtle, said Mama, upon which Pierre burst out laughing and admitted that it had been given to him from a friend. After tea, I took photos of Mama and Pierre. Mama lifted one of the skulls, a large skull of perhaps a wild dog, as a sort of prop for the photograph. And as I was about to take the photograph, she snapped its jaws at Pierre, and the 2 octogenarians laughed collusively, giving me a glimpse of their teenage selves. In 1947, my mother was among a group of Pretoria Girls' High girls who served tea at a garden party being held in honor of the visit to Pretoria of the royal family. It poured with rain, and the school hats made of straw lost their shape. My mother saw a man in full ceremonial outfit, frock coat and top hat, cowering under a large shrub for shelter. She approached him with her tea tray and asked, "Would you like a cup of tea?" "Yes, please," he replied. As she handed his tea to him, he bowed his head in thanks, and much to my mother's delight, the water that had collected in the brim of his hat decanted itself into his cup, displacing the tea completely. About my mother's time at Rhodes University and subsequently at Wits, I know precious little. She had wanted to study medicine, but medicine became one of the many things, as Neil has pointed out, that she had a tremendous interest in for the rest of her life. But she didn't have the necessary science subjects or grades and instead opted for botany. Her stint with African explosives and then the cardiac unit was followed by a 3-year contract with the Colonial Service in northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. There she worked in an agricultural research station in Mount Makulu, 30 miles outside Lusaka, joining the ranks of expatriates who formed communities in the wildest parts of the Commonwealth. The parties were memorable. Mama wore a pink taffeta dress made by her mother to a ball held to celebrate the opening of a new luxury hotel, the Ridgeway. I wonder if it still exists. At another party, caviar was served that had been flown in from Russia, and at another, the champagne arrived late after the men had drunk the whiskey, with predictably unpleasant consequences for them. Bill and Leonie Castle, whose stories of living in northern Rhodesia had inspired my mother to seek work at Mount Makulu, invited her to a party in Mazabuko. My mother had no car, so she caught a goods train. To stop the train, one simply stood at a certain point on the track and held up one's arm. The train driver stopped to allow her to embark and offered her a cup of tea. At the party at the castles, my mother writes, I learned to drink martinis. The guests were formally dressed, dancing a mixture of twist, rock and roll, country, and any old how. Castle was a Latin scholar. When Leonie tired of the party towards midnight, she put on a record of God Save the King, all stood to attention, kissed her goodnight, and left. Professionally, my mother received no training at Mount Makulu and was given rather humdrum work to do. She lived alone and had several encounters with army ants on the march, snakes, indoors and outdoors, and on one occasion was stalked by a leopard while visiting a couple who were her best companions. While boating on the Kafue River, she had an unnerving close encounter with crocodiles. But she lacked young companions. She was the only woman on the research station and the youngest person on the staff. There was no transport other than 2 horses pensioned off by the mounted police. Shortly after her arrival, she was thrown by her horse and broke her arm. With one arm in plaster, she persuaded the farm manager to let her sit on a horse, but the horse unexpectedly stopped at a fence. She writes, I went over the horse's ears in a slow parabola and landed on my good hand, breaking 2 fingers. Now I had 2 arms in plaster, and I was the laughingstock of the Department of Agriculture. I had great difficulty living on my own with bathing and dressing myself. The men with whom she worked gave her to understand that she was a young fool, breaking both arms. I beg your pardon. And she accepted her their perception of her. Over the past 5 years, I spent some time offering my mother an alternative interpretation of this part of her life. As a single woman and the sole woman at a research station, she was not accorded the same easy integration that a man would have enjoyed. She was no fool. She was astonishingly adventurous and brave. In 1956, having returned to Johannesburg, Dr. Maurice McGregor urged her to have a new operation in Britain to repair the atrial septal defect in her heart. This involved open heart surgery in 1956. What are the survival rates? Said Mama. 70%. Sorry, Maurice, that isn't high enough for me. However, he persuaded her that she was the perfect age to have such an invasive operation, and as he was preeminent in the field, he arranged for the best cardiologists in Britain to examine her and the best surgeon in Britain to do the operation. In 1957, she boarded a small plane which hopped up Africa across the Mediterranean to London, Lusaka to Entebbe, stopping at the edge of Lake Victoria for lunch in a tropical hotel. After refueling, it crossed the Sahara Desert for hours and hours, landing in the evening for a night on the Nile, sleeping in rope hammocks under huge ceiling fans. From the Nile to Malta for another night, then Nice and a dark cloud on the horizon, England. My mother, who was not inclined to be dramatic, wrote, "What awaited me there? Open heart surgery, possible death." She was pronounced fit for the operation by a doctor on Harley Street, then sat in a queue at the Brompton Hospital waiting to see Sir Russell Brock. When she was told that he was not attending the clinic that afternoon, she remonstrated with the staff. "I have come all the way from Africa to see him." "Do you want us to page him?" they asked. "If that is in order, yes, please." He appeared. Mama was assessed and told that she was suitable for the operation, but had to wait for a bed to become available. 2 weeks later, she received a call. "Sir Russell has agreed to operate. His fee is £4,000. "How nice of him," said Mama. "I have not got that much money. Sorry." "We'll get back to you," was the response. "Don't go away." The second phone call, Sir Russell's registrar, Mr. Paneath, will do the operation for free. "Sorry," said Mama, "I have worked in cardiology. Dr. Maurice McGregor persuaded me to come over to Sir Russell. I am dubious about this operation. For me, it is Sir Russell or no operation." "Don't go away," was the response. The third phone call, Sir Russell has agreed to do it on the National Health. Mama was eligible because she had been working for the Colonial Service. When admitted to hospital, my mother was given instructions: no eating salt. She had to learn to breathe diaphragmatically without using intercostal muscles. She had explanations on how the blood would be bypassed through a machine till the heart could be stopped, opened, stitched up, the open chest stitched together again, and vital systems restored. The repair itself could take no more than 8 minutes without prejudicing brain function. The operation in total, however, lasted 8 hours. When she came to, she writes, "I was crushed and broken in terrible agony." My mother, always slim as a young woman, lost 20 pounds during the operation. She found it difficult to eat. Just as she was starting to get better, she got Asian flu and caused panic by coughing up a bucket of blood. She was sent to the country to recuperate, and then, via London, took a train to Aberdeen to meet her mother. By the time she reached her destination, Old Meldrum, a Scottish village near Aberdeen, she was very ill. Her temperature shot up. She could hardly breathe. The doctor, a woman wearing a long kilt, was called. She phoned the Brompton, who said that Mom could not be moved until her temperature came down. Her chest was bandaged and plastered with Fuller's earth, a type of clay used in World War I to draw infections. After a few dicey days, my mother writes, my temperature down, my breathing easier, back to London we went. I was readmitted, examined, and told I had post-cardiotomy syndrome. Fiddlesticks! They had cut all membranes lining my chest, lungs, and heart. These damaged membranes were seeping, compressing the lungs. Recuperation period was too brief. They wanted to put me on cortisone. I refused to take it. My mother had booked a passage back to South Africa. You'll have to come too, Margaret. There's no one here to look after you. And so they boarded the ship to Cape Town. On her return to South Africa, aged 27, Mama joined the Department of Agriculture, first in the division of plant control and quarantine for identifying pests and diseases, but later investigating wilt in cotton. This job involved traveling between Barberton and Uppington, 300 miles in opposite directions. True to form, Mama writes, I could not imagine anything more delightful. In Barberton, she met Gerrit and Stella Kerkhoven, with whom she remained in touch intermittently till her death. While in Pretoria, my mother formed a very significant friendship, namely with Christine Frost. Christine later married Larry Scully, Adam has mentioned Larry, who became one of South Africa's preeminent artists. When my mother and Christine met, however, Christine was being courted by Radford Jordan, a divorcee in his late 30s who had 4 children by a previous marriage and 2 previous marriages. Christine regarded Radford as an unsuitable partner, but introduced him to my mother. In my mother's words, we did not take to each other at all. It was Christine and Larry and their circles, which included Walter Battis, who introduced my mother to contemporary artists and art, and she joined the Pretoria Technical College for art lessons after work and was trained by the wildlife painter Zaki Eloff. In 1959, Christine and Larry got married. At the wedding, my mother writes, Radford and I drank too much and got along famously. We got married about 6 months later. Before my mother married my father in 1960, however, she, Christine, Larry, and a friend of my mother's, Arne, attended the crowning of Prince Bareng in Lesotho. Arne Linkquist, who worked for the Swedish embassy, arranged the invitation to the coronation. My father referred to Arne, whom he regarded as a rival for my mother's affections, as Swedie Pie. When they got to Lesotho, Christine, Larry, Arne, and my mother found that there was no accommodation. They resolved to sleep under the stars and drove into a field full of cowpats. Christine, Larry, and Mama rolled up as best they could in blankets. Arne had a tiny tent for one. When it began to drizzle, Larry announced that all 4 of them would have to join Arne in his tent. With her usual capacity for being amused, even in the midst of such discomfort, my mother recorded that because Larry was over 6'6", his legs stuck out of the flap of the tent. The coronation, writes my mother, was worth it. From the grandstand, we saw all Lesotho spilling down the mountainsides in their blankets and conical hats to assemble as a vast heaving mass in the stadium. The Governor-General in his plumed helmet and uniform, sitting several rows before us. The loudspeakers broke down, and chaos prevailed for about 3 hours. The roaring of the whole nation was memorable. By her own account, my mother's exceptionally solitary early years made her very self-sufficient, but equally, it gave her an enormous interest in people. She delighted in them, and once she had established a friendship, she cherished it. It would be impossible to mention all the people and families who have been dear to my mother's heart. From her professional life, from bridge, tennis, book clubs, lunch clubs, U3A, and their numbers have burgeoned since she moved to Orchid Place, and then Reinke's estate. Carol Hadfield, who has steadfastly stepped in to help my mother with practical support in managing her affairs, has my special gratitude for the friendship that she has had with my mother. Having concentrated on my mother's pre-marriage years, I've not included friendships that were made after the marriage to Radford. No account of my mother's friendships would be complete without mention of the Williamsons, who were dearly loved by my mother, and the Martinsons, who have been a mainstay in my mother's life. My mother met Mike Martinson on the Roberts farm in the Michalisburg. However, it was only when she was confined to the Marymount for the birth of Emily in 1961 that she happened to meet Anna Marie, married to Mike, who was confined for the birth of her second-born, Bruce. The Martinson and Jordan children grew up together, not altogether amicably. We regarded them as feral. We were angelic. And the families have remained friends for the past 62 years. Anna Marie and my mother became one another's staunchest friends, as my mother put it. They shared common interests: classical music, books, archaeology, architecture, cinema, art. They played tennis, swam, did water aerobics, went walking, and had coffees at the country club for years, and with such regularity that when Mama and I went to the country club last year, after my mother had not been there for 5 years, members of the staff came to greet my mother by name, and in the same breath, ask after Anna Marie. I suspect, however, that the true binding agent between them was a sense of merriment and a capacity to laugh. Adam recalls them giggling in the pool during aqua aerobics at the country club pool, with Anna Marie saying, "Oh, Margaret, get your knees up." To which Mama replied, "I can't, Anna Marie, my stomach's in the way," followed by fits of helpless giggles from both of them. In June 2015, my mother wrote about her deep sense of always having had to stand on her own 2 feet and to be resourceful on her own behalf. She wrote, "My remedies have been to develop my own interests. I pursue drawing. I pursue an understanding because it absorbs my mind, hence all the difficult books I read. And I seek excellence by joining learned societies, Archaeology Society, Johannesburg Music Society, and the Shakespeare Group. Basically, I am cheerful and sociable, and I have some wonderful friends, remarkable people who seem to love me, and my beloved children and grandchildren. They have been the most extraordinary blessing for me.
Wow. Thank you, Pam. We've now got the part of our memorial for Mum, where we're going to be reading letters, testaments? Tributes, thank you, tributes. Tributes from various family friends, and I'm actually going to ask Neil if he'd like to give the tribute from Anna-Marie first, and then I will give the others. And I know we've been sitting for a while. I think the tributes are probably another 10 minutes.
So I'm going to read on behalf of my mother, who has written from East London and can't be with us today. And she talks about, as you heard, how she met Margaret in Marymount in 1961 when my brother was born, Bruce. My brother Bruce was born. And how that friendship then blossomed into going to the Retiefs Kloof in Magaliesburg multiple times and meeting the families there. And I think the other thing that she emphasizes is when they were older, they played tennis together at the country club. And I remember going there in this heat and seeing these two, or they're actually four old ladies, playing tennis there and being always quite surprised, you know, in the heat, in the Johannesburg summer heat. And the other memory that she has, my mother did a master's, I think, in ethnomathematics. And to that end, she had to travel around to sites where the original inhabitants of South Africa had engraved either in riverbeds or on rock walls or painted, and looked for signs of counting and looked for signs of calculations that had happened there. And my mother says that having Margaret there was a good counterpoint to the established theories. So clearly these, the original learned colonialists had their own opinions on why people were counting, but Margaret provided an interesting alternative ideas. The other thing that she says is that every day she called Margaret, and until recently they spoke, and her conversations usually involved grumbles and laughs about health and family, discussions about books to read and avoid, and our shared histories. These calls were always a source of joy and strength to us both. The tyranny of isolation, of COVID, the long distance and illness always seemed to ease by those calls. So Margaret, your razor-sharp mind, the twinkle in your eyes, your artistic spirit, and our very special friendship will be sorely missed. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Now, forgive me, I haven't actually had a chance to read through all of these yet. So you'll be hearing them for the first time, but so will I. Frances Bradley, Emily's third child, has written a poem to my dearest Granny Margaret. And it reads, "It is difficult to write and capture the essence of someone I hold so dear to my heart, and so it is for my dearest Granny, whose beautiful presence enriched my life. An incredible mind with a library of knowledge, generous in sharing her thoughts and musings, be it politics, the Pope, or Polynesia, the Taliban, war, poverty, evolution, science and books, languages, the planet, bees and honey, her menagerie of a family. Her conversations descriptive and thoughtful, her letters imbued with the richness of care. Every moment together was precious. She loved watching me swim and learn. I'm thankful for our last holiday, with art, avocados, isiZulu, and laughter. I remember running around her cottage with her, radiating the most loving smile, with cheeks wrinkled and joyful eyes, her beautiful chuckle inscribed in my mind. The biggest blessing she gave to this world was the three dear children, Penny, Unk, and Em. All eclectic, eccentric, unique, and wonderful. I thank my dear Granny for life and existence." Since sharing her stoop and art supplies, we wove our lives through virtual screens, capturing moments of joy and laughter and hearing her views on civilization. My life is richer thanks to you, Granny. I love you dearly with all my heart. You live within our thoughts and actions, our kindness, our frankness, our curiosity. Thank you for Mum and for us all. With myriad lessons in life and death, you'll always be our dear, dear Granny, whose resting place will forever be in my heart. Right, deep breath. Sarah Martinson, your daughter, writes, Margaret Jordan was one of the most interesting people I've ever met. Every conversation I had with her was particularly engaging, and I always felt like I came away from it with a new perspective or idea. That's a bit of a common theme. It isn't something I can say about many people, and she knew about everything, from insects to quantum physics. I'm so grateful to have been a small part of her wide, wide life and to have gained so much from it. Thank you, Margaret, and sending so much love. Anne Burnett writes, Margaret will be remembered for her sunny, energetic personality and her special art talent. She lectured school librarianship at JCE from 1997 to 92 and then taught at the Ridge School and then JP Girls as a school librarian. Many of us have our own special memories of Margaret. Her late husband's family had been family friends with my cousins, so we often spent happy hours discovering family history. Rest in peace, dear Margaret, you are a shining star. Ian Williamson, who I grew up with and is my oldest friend, I think I got his hand-me-downs when I was a baby, writes, I will always cherish your mum's chuckle, her gentle guidance, her amazing driving across the Karoo on a 47-degree day and getting onto the floor at the petrol station at Liuchamka. My mother used to drive like a bat out of hell, and when she finally stopped, exhausted and hot, she would get out of the car and lie down on a concrete floor somewhere in the shade until she had recovered. Your mother remains the only person to ever offer me a single malt whiskey and the only person to ever buy me crayfish for lunch and the only person to ever send me to a school principal, retired, in a nice way. Your mum's sense of humour was wonderful, ranging from the pretty dark to the gentle oddities of life. I remember a large but clandestine gathering at her home to watch the then-banned Life of Brian. Ever observant, she knew who was going to laugh at what. I think most of all, she had the ability to get your dad to laugh, or laugh at your dad's more obscure humour. Anna von Vey, Anna Scully, writes, and the Jordans were part of my life even before I was born. Radford had been keen on my mother, who, as we've learned from Penelope, was more taken with my father. The story goes that at my parents' wedding, my mother introduced Radford to one of her very attractive and sparkling friends, Margaret. And so the ongoing Jordan-Scully connection was born. My sister Pamela and I were very close to Emily and Penelope when we were children, and before we moved to Cape Town in our early teens. We both came from somewhat eccentric, intellectual families, and we felt a very close bond with them. At that stage, Adam, who was 4 years younger than us, was just the annoying younger brother. Yeah, I remember that. Margaret did not believe in children hanging about, and activities of one sort or another were always on the go at the Jordan home at North Lodge. Pamela, I and our mother, wonderfully known as Christine Darling, I gave her that name, went on holiday to Durban once with Margaret and the children. We had different ideas of what a holiday was. Margaret had plans for each day in capitals, while our plan was to lie on the beach reading and eating. We had a wonderful holiday, nevertheless, and had several more happy holidays together. The Jordans were something special, with phenomenal intellects, great talents, beauty, and boundless energy. Margaret was the font of all this. She vaguely terrified me as a child, but when I grew up, I felt such an affinity with her and loved her deeply. I also admired her ability to do whatever she put her mind to and simply do it. Margaret was and still is part of the fabric of my life. I'm so glad to still be in touch with Penelope and Adam, my almost siblings, and to know and love Margaret's grandchildren in New Zealand. And there are two more testimonials. Thank you, tributes. Two more. One from Noel Hutton, who I think is actually with us. I got to know Margaret through Adam when he and I were fellow students at Wits many years ago. Margaret took a quick shine to me. I still battle to work out why. One reason, perhaps, was she believed I could rein her son in a bit. Didn't work. What I'm sure about is that every time I visited the Jordan household, I was warmly welcomed and very quickly treated as one of the family. Many such occasions where I visited Adam for study or fun-related reasons, I was quizzed on cricket, art, music, and other topics, all of which I greatly appreciated, much to Adam's sometimes irritation, as I was there to either work or have fun and not be regaled by Margaret. Margaret also knew my father well. They were both stalwarts at the Wits cardio rehab facility that Penny mentions, and they grew to be great friends. In this regard, both my father and I had immense compliments from Margaret in one straightforward statement, which went something like this. Having got to know your father, Noel, I now see where your impeccable manners come from. To this day, I'm very taken aback remembering this wonderful statement. Of late, I visited Margaret at Reinke's retirement estate, where we further discussed art, cricket, the ways of the world, all over wonderful teas and baked goods. My life is without doubt all the better for having known Margaret, and my word to Adam is that I have always seen where his impeccable manners and wonderful friendship came from. Thank you, Noel. It's very undeserved. And finally, Cheska Long Ennis writes, when I think of Margaret, a number of things come to mind. Her quick, incisive intelligence, the breadth of her knowledge of world politics and history, and of current events in general. Her wry sense of humour, which never seemed to fail her, even when she wasn't feeling well. Her love of family and friends, her strong sense of home and place. She was, I felt, a Joburger through and through. And last, but of course, from my point of view not least, her kindness towards my mother, Barbara. I first met Margaret when my mother moved to Reinke's in 2018 and was given the room next to Margaret's. Barbara was a couple of years older than Margaret and very hard of hearing by then, which embarrassed her and caused her to withdraw into herself. As a result, she struggled to integrate into the Reinke's community and kept very much to her own. But Margaret persevered, and by the time the pandemic struck in early 2020, with all its devastating consequences, not least for the elderly living in institutions such as Reinke's, Margaret was Barbara's only real friend. Since I live in Cape Town, I was only able to visit my mother every couple of months, staying for a few days on each visit, and it was during these visits that I began to get to know Margaret. Sometimes we would go to the country club, Margaret, Barbara and I, sit on the veranda and shoot the breeze over lunch and well into the afternoon. And although Barbara did not contribute much to the conversation because of her hearing difficulties, I think she was truly content on those occasions, looking out over the gardens and sensing the companionship of her daughter and her new friend. Naturally, I'll always be grateful to Margaret for those precious moments, amongst the last I was to have with my mother, who we lost in the middle of the pandemic in August 2020. Sometimes after spending time with Mum, I'd visit Margaret in her own room and we'd shoot the breeze some more, surrounded by her sketches of the family and friends she loved, including the one she eventually gave to me, of Barbara. She'd expand in detail on the books she was reading at the time and also tell me a bit about herself and her history. Although I got the sense she loved life and had lived it to the full, and that she looked back on it with gratitude for the happiness she had known, it was also clear to me that Margaret was no stranger to tragedy, that she knew intimately the meaning of loss. I mention this only because of how much I admired the courage and intelligence with which it seemed to me. I'm not particularly religious, but I don't discount that there may be a God and a place where we go when our lives on earth are over. I like to think it's a happy place, that Margaret is there smiling down on us, and that she has found again the people she loved and lost. Wow, this is a powerful letter. Perhaps I like to think she has even bumped into Barbara, and they have become the firm, close friends I'm sure they would have been had they met earlier on in life. As is probably clear from the above, I thought your mother was a remarkable person. She made a strong impression on me, and I'm very glad I had the chance to get to know her, even if only a bit. It would be lovely to meet you too, so if you ever decide to pay a visit to Cape Town, please get in touch. Warmest wishes to you and the family. Thank you. That brings us to a close.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming and sharing these memories. I think the final thing that it behoves me to say is, firstly, if you need relief after sitting for so long, the loos are around the corner here through this door if you want to go straight through. And the other thing I just want to say is these things are a time of sadness and loss and grief. But I urge you to take a look at the photograph of Margaret here, and that's how we should remember her. That she said stuff you to COVID. She survived the worst of COVID, and she enjoyed her life. She enriched other people's lives. And so here's to Margaret.
Here's to Margaret. We do have a tea, by the way. We've got a...
Can I just make an announcement about tea?
Okay.
I'm afraid the storm has collapsed the awning, so there's limited seating outside. Tea is ready and you're most welcome, but I suggest that if you don't find a seat outside, and they're very limited, bring the tea back here or afterwards and sit and chat here.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you so much.
You.
Thank you.